Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Lynn, for the invitation to speak here today. It's my pleasure to be here. So just to give you a sense as to sort of how this will work, our presentations will be delivered on two parts. My presentation will really provide more of an overview of the book itself and how the project came about. And then Liz will offer a sort of deeper dive into her chapter that is part of this collection. So Liz is both co-editor as well as the contributor of a chapter to the collection. To begin, let me begin with two sentences from the book's introduction. The square mile was a powerful symbol in Montreal's urban landscape at the end of the 19th century, an elite residential district that straddled the foot of Mount Royal, elevated above and apart from the city below. It existed as a discrete but roughly defined and porous physical space extending northward from Dorchester Street, Boulevard René Lévesque today, to the slopes of Mount Royal, and bounded by Park Avenue, Bleury Street in the east, and Côte de Neige, Guy Concordia Street in the west. Let me just see if this, oh, my clicker's not working. Oh, there it is, okay. So this opening I provide just to give a sense of the physical space of the square mile itself, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, although I suspect most of you are. And you can see from this slide here that the boundaries I've described just now basically are confirmed by Google Maps. It is the same except for the eastern limit, actually. Google indicates a more limited eastern boundary ending at University instead of Park Avenue. And there are two things that one might note from this slide. First, the boundaries of the square mile can be defined in different ways, and this is something that as editors we accepted, allowing the authors who contributed chapters to set out their own definition of what the square mile is as a physical space. And secondly, note how the square mile becomes golden when a Google search is performed. This is an example of how the square mile continues in some ways to resonate as mythology, and this is a theme that Rod McLeod discusses in detail in the opening chapter of the collection. One of the ideas behind this volume was also to move beyond the immediate urban environment when considering the square mile's history, since so much of what was contained in the locality of the square mile was in fact linked to broader histories connected to signal changes in 19th century social, cultural, and political economic life. The idea for the book came from discussions that Liz and myself started way back in 2018. The following year in 2019, we organized a conference on the history of the square mile, which was held at McGill. And the title of that conference was Crossing Boundaries and Constructing Linkages. And it sort of captured our intention to explore the various linkages that coalesced in the making and development of the square mile. And we were also interested in encouraging a sort of crossing and intermixing of the sometimes siloed boundaries that separated subfields and disciplines. And so that's one of the sort of characteristics of the volume, is you have contributions from various subfields of history and scholars who work in different disciplines altogether. And of course, in the transition from conference to book project, as the title of the volume suggests, Dimitri Anastaskis, chair in Canadian business history at the University of Toronto, joined our editorial team. So that's really a short explanation about how the book sort of came about. Over the next 15, 20 minutes, I'll take us on a sort of tour of the book itself through a variety of images. We begin with this illustration from architectural historian Julia Gersowitz. This is from the first of the 13 vignettes by Gersowitz, which are interspersed between the chapters throughout the book. And she writes, "I scribbled this image to illustrate the singular topography of the square mile," end quote. By the time of the mid-19th century development of the new town, what would later become known as the square mile, well-to-do residents were impressed by the possibilities of the southern slopes of Mount Royal, and the topography set this subsequent pattern of development. That is to say, the most desirable land was on the slopes of the mountain where the largest mansions were constructed. In the chapter that follows by Rod McLeod, once again, the reader's attention is drawn to the mountain. In 1762, Thomas Patent represented, to quote McLeod, "the mountain's stark cliff rising into the clouds, dwarfing the town huddled at the water's edge." Subsequent visitors almost always noticed Mount Royal looming in the distance, notes McLeod. Henry David Thoreau ascended the mountain during a visit to Montreal in 1850, and a quarter century later, Frederick Law Olmsted designed Mount Royal Park in a manner to accentuate the natural features of the summit. By this time, as McLeod notes, the mountainside had already long acquired a romantic cachet connected to the estate of the Scottish fur trader Simon McTavish, whose death in 1804 left an unfinished mansion and spawned Victorian fascination with McTavish's ghostly image. Another Scottish fur trader, James McGill, would leave a very different legacy and become even more powerfully embedded into the built environment and mystique of the square mile. The college he founded, as McLeod observes, would prove one of the most potent symbols of Newtown respectability, and consequently did sterling service attracting residents to adjacent streets. During the 19th century, the old commercial empire of the fur trade was supplanted by the railway and an industrial political economy during the post-Confederation era. So we really see the sort of transition to an industrial economy. And the development of the square mile is in many ways one of the most conspicuous symbols of wealth and power from this era. Impossible to disentangle from the mythologies that became attached to the area and its distinctive topography. McLeod writes, "The much touted national economic dominance of Montreal was essentially the dominance of the mountain." In her chapter, Sherry Olson demonstrates the changing scale and scope of the square mile's reach from the mid-19th to the early 20th centuries. She does so by examining the square mile as an ecosystem involving interactions at multiple levels. Olson writes, "In the 1840s, when so much of the square mile was a garden or orchard, most of the city's workplaces operated at the scale of the household, and the tools most people handled were simple extensions of their own muscle power. Little by little, as more lots were occupied, square milers participated in more partnerships, and some of their corporate ventures grew 10 or 20-fold. End quote. Tracing the evolution of networks in the 1840s and 1880s, Olson ends with an analysis of the 42 men who were identified by the Grain Growers Guide in 1913 as representing, quote, the aristocracy of wealth. And here's a diagram that Olson provides illustrating that, which is really illustrating corporate interlocks of these individuals. And the blue dots in this slide representing Montreal-based people, residents of the square mile, in a few cases residents of Westmount. As is apparent, corporate linkages clustered around key figures. The chapters by McLeod and Olson constitute the first part of the book, and situate the square mile in broader historiographical and historical contexts. And really, the chapters that follow offer a close analysis of selected subjects and themes. The second section of the book, chapters 3 and 4, examine the formation of business institutions and networks of the square mile. Jean-Philippe Mathieu's chapter examines how a Scottish hardware merchant, Thomas Moreland, rose to prominence socially and in the business world to spearhead the formation of Montreal Rolling Mills in 1868. As a joint stock corporation, Montreal Rolling Mills exemplified the shift away from direct proprietorship and limited partnerships to the increasing prevalence of corporations in business life. Yet this transition was clearly not a faceless one, as suggested by this map from Mathieu's chapter, showing that 11 of the 18 founding directors of Montreal Rolling Mills were square mile residents or lived just adjacent to the area. Social status and connections and business strategies coalesced. Max Heyman's chapter examines Donald Smith's personal and familial networks from the fur trade. This is perhaps a familiar picture of Smith driving the last spike of the Transcontinental Railway at Craigellachie in 1885. Really one of the era's most iconic images. Heyman, by contrast, explores how Smith's wife, Isabella Hardesty, played a decisive role in situating Smith in the commercial networks of the fur trade, which ultimately helped sustain Smith's rise to prominence. Of an elite Métis family, Isabella Hardesty provided Smith with legitimacy in the Northwest that gave him public credibility, and these ties would remain meaningful for the Smith-Hardesty family after they removed themselves to the square mile. To understand this urban space, writes Heyman, we need to see it as entangled threads of an invisible web of family and personal ties spread across the continent. The next section of the book, part 3, is composed of 3 chapters addressing the subjects of family, gender, and property. Chapter 5 by Peter Gossage and Lisa Moore offers a case study in the operation of judicial separation of property permitted under Article 1311 of the Civil Code. In November 1884, Annie Stevenson Anderson sued her husband, David Morris, for separation of property. And this is, on this slide, you can see pictures of Annie and David Morris. David Morris, he was a leading textile manufacturer who was hard hit by the economic crisis that descended upon the industry in 1883 and 1884. And through careful investigation, Gossage and Moore show that Anderson, in bringing the suit against her husband, was in fact working with him to shift assets to her control in order to guard them from creditors. Their success in navigating a period of extreme financial uncertainty was also aided by important legal and political connections with which Gossage and Moore detail in the chapter. And so part of this talk is meant to sort of sell the book. So if you want to know more about this, you're going to have to read the chapter. And a sign that David and Annie remained essentially together throughout this period is also suggested by the fact that they stayed married for over 50 years until their deaths 3 weeks apart in 1914. Chapter 6 by Liz Kirkland and Marianne Putinen offers a close account of the personal and family ties of Amy Redpath Roddick. Liz will be saying more about this in a few minutes. Robert Sweeney's chapter examines the fundamental role of gender in shaping social relations in the square mile. drawing upon data from the Montreal L'Avenir du Passé project that he co-directed with Sherry Olson. Sweeney offers a series of illuminating maps. This map shows property values in the square mile in 1903. It's not that surprising. It's showing that property was very valuable in the square mile. However, this map may be surprising. It shows that women owned 1/3 of all individually owned properties in the square mile in 1903. And here is a map showing marital status of the female property owners during this period. So you have unmarried women, you have married women, you have widows. They all own significant property in the square mile at the beginning of the 20th century. Sweeney argues that this situation existed within the context of women's roles in familial investment strategies and that women actively managed properties. Where in the world today do women own such a major economic asset, asks Sweeney provocatively. Part 4 centers on the themes of professional and business worlds in transformation. We also, by this point of the book, move more firmly into the 20th century. So there is a sort of chronological progression that occurs within the book. Before he became Lord Beaverbrook, New Brunswick-born Max Aitken was a youthful securities dealer and promoter whose rise in Canadian finance brought him to Halifax and then Montreal's Square Mile, where he resided from 1907 to 1910 in this residence, which is currently the home of the Italian Consulate of Montreal. In Chapter 8, Greg Marshallden tells the story of how Aitken orchestrated new corporate consolidation with the creation of Canadian Car and Foundry, the Steel Company of Canada, and Canada Cement. But in the process, he also alienated himself from Montreal's relatively staid business elite. Aitken left Montreal for England feeling rejected, his application for membership in the Mount Royal Club having been denied. Though in Montreal for a short period, Aitken was an exemplar of the new financial capitalism of the period, and men who arrived with Aitken from the Maritimes, namely Isaac Walton Killam and Ward C. Pitfield, assumed control of Aitken's Montreal-based operations shortly after his departure. So though he was in Montreal for a relatively short period, he had a significant impact in the city and certainly in Square Mile society. Anne-Marie Adams' chapter investigates a different network that shaped the Square Mile. Adams begins with the Scottish-born architects Percy Nobbs and Ramsay Turkir. Nobbs was director of McGill's School of Architecture and Macdonald Chair, and successfully worked to ensure that Turkir would succeed him in that position. This episode was, Adams argues, characteristic of the operation of a Scottish buddy system that facilitated the entry of Scottish architects into Montreal's professional life, which is illustrated in part in this diagram, as well as the map, which shows the birthplace of the Scottish architects that are part of Anne-Marie Adams's investigation. These networks were also entangled with the broader Scottish architectural influence in the Square Mile. One example that Anne-Marie Adams points to in the book is Royal Victoria Hospital. Adams's chapter also speaks explicitly to a factor embedded throughout the book, the prominence of Scots in the history of the Square Mile. So just think about the names that I've mentioned so far: McTavish, McGill, Smith, Moreland, and Morris. all migrants from Scotland. The McLennans were another stalwart family of the square mile. Around the time of the founding of Montreal Rolling Mills, Hugh McLennan established the Montreal Transportation Company, which became one of Montreal's most important shipping firms. Following Hugh McLennan's death in 1899, his son Bartlett McLennan assumed control of the company. In the early 20th century, it remained a conservatively managed firm tied to a small circle of prominent square mile families, including the Allens and the Ogilvies. This table here just shows the general profitability of the company during the early 20th century. Stephen Salmon begins chapter 10 on the battlefields of Europe and Lieutenant Colonel Bartlett McLennan's death outside Amiens in August 1918. The Great War was a watershed event. The 19th century world from which the square mile emerged would not truly survive the war. Among the changes were in the business world. With the demand of shipping increasing during the wartime, an expatriate American, Roy Wolven, and his partner, J.W. Norcross, commenced in 1916 a successful takeover of the Montreal Transportation Company. While Roy Wolven's asset stripping strategy succeeded in the short term and brought him personal profit, the old foundations of the enterprise had been eroded. Had Bartlett McLennan survived the Great War, Salmon speculates, it is doubtful that he would have recognized what had happened to his old firm. The last section of the book, part 5, continues engagement with the themes of crisis and decline. Nicholas Kenny's chapter also begins in Europe with a young Canadian officer and square mile resident stationed in northern France, Talbot Papineau. Analyzing Papineau's wartime correspondence alongside the correspondence of a working-class naval reservist named Willie Firth, Kenny pursues a comparative analysis of the roles of class, gender, and imperial dynamics in shaping perceptions of the war and its significance. More particularly, Kenny explores the interior life and emotions of his subjects. Here, the reader is given insight into the attitudes that inspired Papineau and other square mile men to enlist, and the emotionally and politically significant attachments to home during the war. Papineau was killed in action at Passchendaele, and as Kenny notes, square mile society emerged shaken from the conflict. Julia Gersowitz's final vignette is titled The 1920s, Beginning of the End. Many square mile households lost sons during the war, and as Gersowitz writes, quote, the age of building the great mansions was over, end quote. Developers turned to the construction of signature apartment buildings, and we can sort of see this transformation on Sherbrooke Street on the slide here. The demolitions during the decade only accelerated after the Second World War, and this brings us to the final chapter of the book by Harold Berube. We are taken to the scene of the Van Horn Mansion and its controversial demolition in September 1973. While the contestation between a short-sighted developer and community activists over the Van Horn Mansion was a high-profile and consequential event, Berube shows that it alone does not fully capture the broader structural transformations that worked to erode much of the square miles built environment after the Second World War. Through a close analysis of one block, on this slide, the Sherbrooke, Burnside, McGill College, Victoria City block, through analysis of this single block over the period from 1945 to 1985, Berube shows how real estate transactions undermined the foundations of the square mile. The decisive shift commenced in the 1960s, really, as the block passed from individual proprietors to corporations, and by 1981, the block had become consolidated into superlots. Situating this particular case within the broader context of Montreal's post-1945 development, Berube concludes that in many ways the square mile died as it was born through the lucrative activities of landowners, developers, and promoters. Berube's emphasis on the complexity and the multi-causal nature of historical transformation is an appropriate closing to the chapters. The contributors to the collection have all taken seriously the complexity of their chosen subjects and have demonstrated an intellectual openness and generosity that have made the book what it is. And I mean, I'm a little biased. I think it's a good book. And finally, the volume ends with an afterword by Brian Young, who discusses his personal and historical encounters with the square mile following his arrival at McGill in 1976 as a history professor. And Young incisively identifies connecting themes and traces the signal shifts in how the square mile has been written about over the last few decades. And with that, I would like to turn the floor over to one of the individuals who has been engaged in sort of rewriting and writing the history of the square mile, and my co-editor, Liz Kirkland. Liz.
I have heard Don talk about the book twice now, and he does such an amazing job of summarizing 400 pages or something for us. Thank you, Don. That's amazing. So my task today is to give a bit more of a deep dive into one of these chapters. I wrote this chapter with Marianne Potanen, and the idea that we wanted to, the question we wanted to ask, we know that we have this amazing resource in Montreal in the form of the Notman photographs, that these pictures provide a visual record of what was going on in the square mile. They document the affluence and the prestige that undergirded the growth of this neighborhood. And it's really an amazing artifact for us today as we look back. But we also are aware that these images were created, produced, staged, curated, kept or not kept, and on multiple levels, by the clients, by the photographers, by the families after the fact. And so we wanted to ask the question, could we take one of Notman's subjects, someone he photographed a lot, and try to understand what was being shown in the images, but also what was happening behind the scenes? How can we understand the emotions, the lived experiences of someone who lived their whole life in this neighborhood? And so you will see that we chose Amy Redpath, later Roddick, who may be a familiar person to some of you here. And as we explored her life, what we found, I'm sort of going to give away the conclusion now, is that life was very similar inside the square mile and outside the square mile. That although there was some buffering that social and material capital could give, at the end of the day, they also experienced all the emotions, that they had to experience celebration and despair and loss and grief and joy in much the same ways that other people did. So let me introduce a little bit of who this Amy. Amy is sitting here in her living room. We'll come back to this picture at the end. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. So this is Amy Roddick in her living room in 1930. And this was the image we began with. It gives us a good picture of her life inside her living room. You can see there are aspects of elite status here. We see beautiful furniture, high ceilings, but we also see her in the photo, but turned away just slightly, not really able to see what is going on her face. We'll come back to this at the end. So Amy, if you know the Redpath family off by heart, then you'll know where she fits, but likely you don't. So she was the granddaughter of John Redpath, of the sugar magnate. And her father was John James Redpath, and he was the youngest son of John Redpath's first marriage, if you want to track this. By the time Amy was born in 1868, John James was living on income. He wasn't working for the sugar business anymore. He and his wife, Ada Mills, were living in England. So Ada Mills, this will also maybe be a familiar name. Her father was the mayor of Montreal. Her grandmother, her grandparents were the Lymans, so of pharmaceutical and education fame. This is the same family. So Amy really came from some pretty important families here in the Square Mile. Her family was living just south of London, England, and both Amy and her brother Peter were born there. But by the time Amy was about 3, the family had moved to this house on Sherbrooke Street, 1065 Sherbrooke Street. 3 other brothers joined the crew so that, oh, there you can see where it was on Sherbrooke Street. So that by the time Amy was living her life full-time, this is what the household looked like with the 5 children and the dog. I love this image on the left where Amy is in the center. I think she was the only daughter, but she was the eldest, and she did a lot of helping to raise those brothers of hers. Yeah, I also love that she has her feet up on the dog on that second one. So Amy and her brothers were brought up in a pretty big network of aunts and uncles. If you track the Redpath family tree, there were lots of aunts and uncles to be had around and cousins. And she had a very active childhood, engaging with all of these different family members. But tragedy did hit the family. So on the left-hand side, you see a picture of Amy when she was 14, and on the right-hand side, that's a picture of Amy when she was 18. Right in between here, when she was 16, her father died. John James died. This was also the beginning of a pretty significant decline in her mother's health. And in essence, Amy became the de facto head of household in many ways. She was the eldest child. She had help from uncles. Her uncle George Drummond, for example, helped with a lot of the financial decisions. But Amy, in so many ways, stepped into the role of managing social obligations. She supervised the staff. She eventually would decide who would be hired and who would be fired as domestic servants. And she spent many, many hours monitoring and caring for her mother's health, arranging for doctors to come, spending hours visiting and reading with her mother in her room. After maybe a decade, so by the time Amy was in her mid-20s, her mother was more or less confined to her bedroom all the time. And so Amy would spend hours reading to her there. Now, one of the reasons we're able to study Amy and try and understand what was happening behind the scenes is that Amy left diaries. She wrote poetry. We have her correspondence, some of her correspondence. She wrote plays, poetry, novellas. And so it gives us not just a sense of what she was doing, but it also lets us have a little insight into how she felt about it. She gives opinions quite freely in her diaries. So we do have a sense of where she found fulfillment. She had a very close relationship with her youngest brother, whose name was Cliff. Now, quite suddenly, in 1901, she writes about New Year's Day, and then the diary goes quiet. It's blank for pages and pages and pages and pages and pages. So we don't know exactly what went down in June of 1901, at least not from Amy's perspective. But this was a moment that has been studied quite a bit in the field of Canadian history. There's a Canadian Mysteries website where you can go and do some research yourself. It's really brilliantly done with all kinds of evidence that you can go and try and figure out what happened. But I'll try and give you a little rundown of what we know happened on June 13th, 1901. Peter Redpath, he was the brother just younger than Amy. He was home that day, along with his mother and 2 domestic servants. Peter gave a testimony at the inquest that his youngest brother, Cliff, who was in law school, had just finished law school, arrived home at 6 p.m. and looked very tired. Cliff then went up the stairs to visit his mother. Seconds later, 3 gunshots were heard. Peter then ran up the stairs and tried to get into the mother's room, but the door was locked. He had to break down the door, and when he got in, both Cliff and the mother were on the floor with head wounds, gunshot wounds to their heads. According to the official report, Ada was declared dead at the scene. Cliff died an hour or so later when he was admitted to the hospital. The 2 maids, we know, ran to a neighbor's house to try and get help from a doctor, but the police were never called. So we don't have a police report on this. We don't know exactly what happened because we have to depend on Peter's testimony and a couple other than maids made testimonies as well at the inquest. But we could imagine that this would have been a major scandal for the Redpath family and a source of gossip around Montreal. So our chapter really looks at how did Amy, as this sort of now actually the head of household, how did she navigate this scandal? How did she handle her own personal grief? She was devastated by this, obviously, while still maintaining some sort of public distance from that, trying to make things okay in the public realm. So we take her life in the immediate thereafter, but we also go all the way to her death. She ended up living 5 more decades in this house. She spent the rest of her life living in this house and didn't die until 1954. So what kinds of things did Amy do? Well, first of all, I told you she didn't call the police. Nobody ever called the police, so there was no police report. The doctor who came to do the medical, to give the medical testimony was a young chap by the name, he wasn't young at that point actually, was a man named Dr. Thomas Roddick, who you might know will become Amy's husband in a couple of years. And on the coroner's inquest committee, it was made up of their neighbors and friends. So when the coroner's report finally came out, the finding was that Cliff had had a moment of temporary epilepsy and had killed his mother and then himself as a result of an epileptic fit. So this, of course, gave a respectability to it. It would have allowed them to have full funerals in the High Anglican Church, which they did. And both Cliff and Ada were buried in Mount Royal Cemetery. The family refused to have any interaction with the press, so they gave no official word to the newspapers. And Amy, as soon as possible, left to go to England. And she stayed for several months in a manor house of her Aunt Grace Redpath, Peter and Grace Redpath. She stayed at their mansion, their chateau, Chislehurst. She really reduced her group of friends and family that she interacted with. Was really a couple aunts and uncles, cousins, and one of the domestic servants who was there that day, a young woman named Rose Shallow. We also remember and notice that in her diary, there is almost a year of complete silence. So we assume that things were troublesome already by January, and there's no more mention of anything in her diary for a year, which is a very unusual thing for Amy. So certainly this was a pivot point in Amy's life. I think she felt a before and after, and her life did continue. I just told you that I've been slow on the pictures. This was Cliff, both in his law school graduation and then also with their dog. Which brings us to Dr. Thomas Roddick. So this is Tom Roddick. He is very well known in medical circles for having studied under Lister. and bringing Lister's techniques to Montreal, even though not everyone believed in Lister's techniques. He brought them and insisted that they be implemented. He became head of the medical school, medical faculty at McGill. This is a picture of their wedding day. Amy was 38, he was 60. This is at Chislehurst. And they spent the rest of their lives quite companionately. Amy turned to poetry and drama to process some of her feelings. I don't know where that poem is. Do I have her poem? Yes. So this is, amongst her writings, we see some sense of the grief that she experienced, that she never, this one did not get published publicly, but it stayed in her own personal writings. To JCR, so Jocelyn Clifford Redpath, her brother. Must I dwell alone the many dismal morrows, far from blissful hope together spanned, hope of service through assuaging dearth and sorrows, hope of golden deeds together planned? No, the heavy mourning weeds I tear asunder, struggle from the clouds that blacken round, close my ears to their unholy, woesome thunder, rise anew to life from grief unbound. Another person that I want to take mention of is her relationship that she had with Rose Shallow. So this was the maid who was present at the time of the shooting. Rose had only been there for about a year, and Rose ended up staying with her for the rest of Rose's life. Rose had come from Newfoundland, and about a year after it happened, at the end of 1902, Rose invited her sister Maggie to also work with Amy Redpath. And wherever Amy went, there too did Rose go. So you can see these photographs we have here. On the left, we have Amy and Rose in Egypt together. And this is just a very lovely stage photograph of Amy and Rose taken by, actually, I'm not totally sure it's a Notman. I think it's a Notman photo. Rose played an interesting role in Amy's life. We aren't totally sure what the nature of that was, and I don't want to put a 21st century label on it because I think that would be an unfair thing to do. But Rose became so important that Amy, for example, left all her wearing apparel to Rose in her will. When Rose, who ended up dying before Amy, when she was buried, her family initially had her buried in the Catholic cemetery. Amy had her body exhumed and buried in the Redpath grave alongside where Amy would eventually be. And on her gravestone it says, Mary Rose Shallow, beloved companion of Amy Redpath Roddick. And I think as we sort of tackled this question of what was going on behind the scenes in Amy's life, how was she navigating? We have this extraordinary crisis, but there was also lots of ordinary life that Amy had to navigate. And what we have found when we take this broad look, we have found that Amy, like so many of us, sought to create boundaries between what was her private life, what did she keep hidden, and what did she project to the rest of society. And so we end with that. Oh, I forgot to mention the Roddick Gates. This is an important part. So one thing Amy did to help create this public image was what Brian Young has referred to as leaving a mark on the landscape. So these are the Roddick Gates at the entrance of McGill University. They were paid for by Amy, by her own personal money, in honor of her husband, Thomas Roddick. And you probably, or you may know the story about the clock. They had a clock built in it because Tom hated it when students were late to class. So he wanted to make sure they would all know what time it was. But we argue that this was part of image construction, that she was trying to say, this is who we are. This is the kind of mark we want to leave. This is how we want to be remembered by Montrealers. So we have this final, I think I have the final photograph here of Amy in her living room. Oops, I'm really not good at this. I'm sorry, Dawn. So we have Amy sitting here. in her 1930, that again, I'm remembering that this is a staged photograph, remembering that this is how she wanted this photograph to be taken. This beautiful picture of her seemingly at peace in her living room, reading a book, sitting on her couch, but with her head turned away, not wanting to expose too much of her personal struggles, her personal emotions. So we argue that inside every one of the Square Mile homes, the same kinds of stories were being played out. Illness and early death, romance and solitude, secrets and accomplishments. Identities were being both constructed and hidden, public ones for the camera and private ones for when the camera was gone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Don, would you come back with Liz? And I'll ask our IT guy to give us a shot of our two guest speakers, Don Nerbas and Liz Kirkland. Now, we have a few minutes for questions. If anyone here in the auditorium would like to ask, I'll bring you the mic so the Zoom audience will be able to hear. Hands up. Is there, yes, I'm coming with the mic.
Are there any relatives of these families still alive or around?
Yes. There are many of the relatives. The Redpath relatives, for example, Linda Redpath is still alive. She's the great niece, and she has maintained some of these. Some of these photographs come from her personal collection. So there are, I don't know if you want to be more specific, but there are families still around. Yep.
There must be a lot of descendants because John Redpath had 17 children.
That's right.
Jason, are there any questions in the Zoom chat? No. Okay. Anyone else here in the auditorium with a question? Would you tell us a little bit about the book's reception? It's been out now for more than a month, hasn't it?
Oh, okay. Well, actually, the book's reception, I mean, it's hard to know because it's so new, I suppose. And so this is one of the challenges of, I guess, academic publishing as well, as how long the process was to actually bring this to publication. You'll note that we had the conference in 2019, and the book is published in this year, so that's about 5 years. So I think the first sort of review came out in where did it come out again?
The Canada Review of Books, Canadian Review of Books.
Oh, the Literary Review
The
of
Literary
Canada.
Review of Canada.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a little blurb there that was a positive review. So and yeah, it's sort of early though to know.
Okay. Now we have a Zoom question. Ralph Levitt, past president of the Atwater Library, asked if John Redpath was a founder of our organization, and indeed he was. And on November 21st, a month from now, John Redpath will be the subject of our Lunchtime Series event. The St. Andrews Society is co-hosting with the Atwater Library a talk by his biographer, Richard Felto, who's coming from Toronto. So I really encourage you to come back for that. Okay, I see more. Peter McNally.
Thank you. Two very interesting and important talks. I attended the conference in 2019, and I recall at the time and subsequently several people making the comment that the story of the Square Mile pre-World War I and families like the Redpath, although it's a Canadian story, it doesn't seem to resonate today as a Quebecois story. In other words, it doesn't fit into a narrative that fits into Quebec Francophone society. And I'm just wondering if you would agree or disagree with this, or you found anything to suggest that this did or did not resonate.
I'm I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. I think that is both true and myth, I would say, a little bit. I think in the book, we've really tried to show how this neighborhood fitted into multiple international networks. And I also think that, thinking about Canada sort of continentally, but also thinking about British Empire. But I also think one of the things that is not central in this book, but it comes across, is while the Square Mile is known as sort of this Anglophone Protestant bastion, there were many Francophones, Catholic, Anglophones, so the Hingston family, right central at the corner. But there were also very well-known Quebecers who lived here, who were Quebec French Canadian nationalists. So Marie Gérin Lajoie lived on Sherbrooke Street, and she was one of the founding feminists of the Quebec nation, Quebec national movements. But I agree that it hasn't been written that way. We haven't understood it that way. Dawn, I don't know if you want to add.